Ele era um excelente pianista.
Foi assim, a gente estava no início do namoro.
Eu não saberia definir o Tenório, não.
O Tenório era maravilhoso.
All that was left of Tenorio were dispersed fragments.
Bueno, good morning and welcome to all of you to the new edition of the San Sebastian Film Festival. We have with us, welcome us to a new edition of the International Film Festival in San Sebastian. In its 71st edition, we have with us, presenting the film, They Shot the Piano Player, with Javier Mariscal and Fernando TRUEBA, both the directors of the film. And as you know how we work, please raise your hand when you have a question and I'll write it down and we'll give you a microphone. But first of all, to start the press conference, I have a question, quite specific, and due to the fact that it's the first press conference that we're holding this year in the film festival, you're inaugurating the press conferences, and the film we specifically mentioned to the history of cinema. I would like to ask you about that statement. You say that Bossa Nova and the Nouvelle Vague changed the story of the history of music and cinema. I would like to know, in what sense do you see that statement, albeit it's explained in the film that obviously it's not the center. What parallelism do you see between cinema and modernity in the 1950s in the appearance or the emergence of Bossa Nova? Yes, I think it's a point of inflection in cinema and in music. It's the feeling that there's an ancient world and a world with ties, for example, and we enter into another world which is modern, in a different way of telling stories and a different way of singing, a different way of writing and composing songs which are different, that though undoubtedly both movements, the Brazilian musical movement as well as the French cinema movement, have date back to tradition. Some are looking back to the American or French or classics or Rossellini, and others are looking back to samba and Frank Sinatra. So therefore, nothing is completely new, nor is it a rupture. Everything's a renewal. Both movements are contemporary, that they take place in 1958, and they're already in there in 1959 when the famous record by João Gilberto comes out, and when the films of that new French generation in Cannes in 1959 emerges also. And there's a curious thing is that the film that wins Cannes Film Festival that the year is Orfeo Negro by Camille, which has Joe Bibi and Venetia's music, albeit it's not a film. Venetia's asked for him to take his name away from the credits because he didn't like the film at all, but it had this marvelous music, and they got together, albeit symbolically. The French cinema, the Nouvelle Vague, he said, yes, I think there are two movements which are contemporary, and it's quite curious that this film that deals with music, history, politics, movement, and a specific character without looking for it, but the cinema is underlying not only the title and the mention to the new wave or the Nouvelle Vague, but when we were working on it, working on the film, there were times where for the flashbacks, sometimes, not always, we use some cinematographic references. What do you think about this and this style? And other times they were more directly plastic, that Xavi designed or whatever. Yes, a question here. When I saw the film, when you were talking about the musical touch, I was thinking directly in the Lubitsch touch, which has nothing to do, but that's our cinematographic imaginary exists there. Yeah, the question is, I had a question for both of you, another specific one for Javier Mariscal that perhaps both of you could probably answer this. The first question is, working together how do you work together? You'd worked with Chico and Rita together. You know each other very well. But whether there's a lot of debate, or how do you come to an agreement to design something specific in the film? More the difference, shall we say, between comic, which the film has, and the film itself. What are the differences which are more interesting, or that you could talk about, for example? I'm very curious to know about the colors. The colors, how are they vis-a-vis a comic per se, and to put them on the screen, whether it's much more complicated or whether there's no greater difference, or... Thank you very much. We work very well. Every time I see one of Xavier's drawings, I'm overwhelmed and I enjoy it, and I'm astonished. I love to see him when he's drawing and painting. I have a good time, and sometimes we also discuss things and argue, but we argue well, how we have to do it, as you should. Working with Fernando, it's a gift. I always say that in his mind he's got the shelves of IKEA with a robot that does this, it moves around, and he finds the word and he finds the name and the year and whatever. I'm not a big fan of IKEA. Yes, I know you're not, but I mean, it's a kind of... Because in this sense, I was born, I never had a memory. I don't remember the names of anyone. I've got a very impoverished brain. But Fernando has a culture which is it's incredible, because he always helps me. He sends me music continuously. He says, read this book, and so on. This film, the good thing about it is that for quite a long time, while he was doing his research, I was able to share it with him at his home and in his studio in Madrid. And I said, well, listen, I've got these interviews and this, that, and the other. And perhaps the secret of Chico and Rita, and they shot the piano player, is that it's quite clear where Fernando starts, where he contributed first of all a script, which was well structured and quite very precise, that wasn't touched, very little later on, and he also provided for me, and that was of fundamental importance, which all of the audio of the interviews and a lot of references of photographs, not only of Tenorio, but because it was a documentary at the end of the day. So my work is always these texts, these words that are written on paper, these papers that were written, turn them into dots, lines and colors, which is how put them into images. So what type of characters the film asking for all the time? The script says, what is the film asking for me to do? What type of, what palette of colors should I use? From the outset, we talked about these things together. It's quite obvious there's a part which is the year 2000, which is the realistic side, or where Fernando is doing in the film. It's the guy's name is Jeff. It does all this research work, and then you've got that part which is their memory, what they remember. And in any film, this is 6, 4, 2, 3 characters. Here there are 2,400. No, I think it was about 34 interviewees and several characters at the same time, and all of this you have to start up and to address, to allow things to fit into their place, and to share it continuously between each other. The first part is creation, and then you've got another part which is when you enter into the production, which is another wavelength, shall we say. Hi, good morning. Congratulations for the film. Initially, it's a musical, but then it's a political thriller. Fernando, first of all, why? When do you discover Tenorio Jr. and why you decide that it has to be a film with and to do it with Mariscal? Well, I discovered it in 2004 when I'm shooting The Miracle of Candeal in Brazil. Then buying records, they were re-editing and republishing the music of the 60s and 70s that had been out of circulation, and I hear Tenorio for the first time in a record of musicians that I like very much, like Paulo Moura, and all of a sudden there was a pianist who I didn't know. And slowly but surely I start to dig into and find more records, and I see there aren't two records of his anywhere, and I say, is he dead or what's going on? And I come up against the issue of the missing. Internet was still rudimentary. You couldn't find practically very few things you could find on the internet, and I started slowly but surely, without a clear awareness at the beginning of what I wanted or what I was looking for. I slowly but surely I started to do some interviews. The first one was done here in San Sebastian. I discovered that there's going to be a documentary shown which is called Vinicius, and I come from Madrid just to see that documentary. And so thinking whether I can find something about the story, the documentary was a biographical documentary about Vinicius, about his life and his work, and there were no references there. But the producer was the elder daughter of Vinicius, Susana. We became friends here in San Sebastian. Of her and Miguel Faria, the director, and Rui Guerra, that was here with the film. And so therefore, this small Brazilian delegation, I took them to the Dickens. They drank all of the gin tonics that the Dickens had in the bar. And we spent 3 days drinking and eating here. They came to Madrid before leaving for Brazil. And they came to my house, and that's where I shoot at the hotel where I'm staying at now. A first interview to Susana in her room, where she tells me what she remembers of that period. That was the initial interview. As of there, I started to take things a bit more seriously, and that's where we started to organize trips to Brazil, Argentina, and so on, and to look for people. I had an assistant in Brazil who organized and was looking for all of the people and trying to get them together. There were several trips distributed over 2 and a bit years, and that's where we interviewed practically 150 people over several months, and friends, musicians who had played with him, his family, people who were related with the case or who had investigated or belonged to the human rights organizations in Argentina and Brazil. Totally about 150 hours of interviews. I was thinking at that time that I was going to make a documentary, and then subsequently, once I'd shot all of that material, we did Chico and Rita, which was quite a long process. And during the Chico and Rita process, I was thinking, it came to my idea that this film would be good in animation. And I thought it was crazy to think. I didn't even want to tell anybody, so I was waiting that I wasn't going to remember it on the day after what I thought about of this incredible idea. But months were going by, and the idea became stronger. And it wasn't a crazy idea. I thought it was all the contrary. I thought it was the right way to do it. So therefore, I dared to ask Cristina, my producer and my companion who's sitting there, Cristina Huerta, I dared ask her and tell her this, and so I thought she was going to react. No, she said, "Oh, okay, that's curious." I think she thought I wasn't saying it seriously, but then I talked to Xavi, and he looked very happy at the idea of making a film together, and that story that he knew about, because over these years, every friend who I had dinner with, I was telling him about the story of Tenorio, all the time, the new things that I discovered about him. I was like hanging up like I was hung up with and hooked on Tenorio. So therefore, at the end of the day, that idea was imposed. Why? Because I realized that if you're going to make a documentary, it becomes, first of all, in something of people saying, oh, yes, I knew him. Oh, good. We played together in the festival so-and-so. No, yes. And all of a sudden, at the end, you say, if it's just a long a long list of people who are talking, but the character was missing. But if I did it in animation, it could be the story of someone who's alive, the story of someone who walked, who had children, who had a wife, and who played with people in music. And you can see him in the studio when he was recording when he was 23 years old. His only record as a leader and so on and so forth, which all of a sudden the film of that alley in Rio de Janeiro with all that music comments where there are none of those bars are left nowadays, but we were able to reconstruct that in animation and recreate with animation. So therefore, that was a key issue in order to decide, not that all of the stories can be told in animation. I think that's not the case. But when you're going to tell a story, you've got to see what's the most appropriate language to tell that story with. So therefore, in this case, I thought what I had discovered with Xavi in Chico and Rita, which was the right way to tell the story of Tenorio Jr. Hi, over here in the front row on the left here. I would like to ask you, what was it like to work with Jeff Goldblum again in this film, who gives a voice to the leading character in a different medium, for example, which is animation. And technically, when deciding all of the frames in which the characters moved in, what creatively drove you to how we see the final result on the screen? Thank you very much. I'll answer the first question and you answer the second. Well, with Jeff, I'd worked in 1988-89, we've always maintained a good friendship, and he's a great guy. I went to Los Angeles and I listen, because he's a piano player, by the way. I don't know if you know, I always listen to him play music in a club where he used to play with very good musicians in Los Angeles. Now he's recorded records, and when I wrote the script of the film, I put Jeff into the character with the hope that he might do it, but you're never sure that's going to happen. When I sent him the script, he liked it very much, and he said, great, I'll do it for you. And that was the case, and he did it. And for me, not because we were friends and we had a good relationship, it's because I consider, and I'm not sure whether it's right or wrong, but I'm convinced that it's the best voice in American cinema. It's the only voice that isn't academic, and it's not boring at all. When Jeff is going to say, read a line, you don't know how he's going to read it or say it. It's like a jazz musician playing a solo piece. He's very creative when he talks. He has a way of talking, of saying what he says, which is quite unique, and that gives it a lot of life, and that's what we were looking for. We were looking for that life in the film, in the character. What you asked about the movement, we had to do very realistic type of interviews. We had some videos, and especially audio, recorded by Fernando already. I'm not too sure, but I think I don't like... Well, from the outset, I thought that it's a film that had to risk itself. I like to jump over the cliff and to open up new pathways, and I think it's very risky what we've done. What we've done, as I say, to take, if there are 200 frames, to throw into the garbage, the majority of them, you keep the expressions and those moments in which you believe are more powerful on the screen. And from there, you do a type of animation, which at the end of the day, what we were looking for, the whole team and crew, was for the audience to animate it at the same time, for there to be a process of as an accomplice, so that the audience can get into the screen and you're not drinking a milkshake, but it's like raw meat that you have to digest. I'm not, no, perhaps I don't know how to explain myself too well, but I liked to look other ways of doing things. There are machines, well, not machines, but there are programs to be able to see what happened, but what could happen. But for example, it's quite risky as well. There's a section in which they're playing in the studio with a saxophone, etc., through very marvelous young musicians at the School of Music in Barcelona, and with Chano Dominguez. Fernando was shooting with some cameras and seeing, and from there what we did was set it up that way, and from there I'm not an animator, and plus I used to work with Photoshop, so I animated them with Photoshop, not everything, because Marcelo was helped me quite a lot. But all of those sections in the brass and the music such, what I did was drag them out and change them, and all of a sudden a frame, I give it 1, but I give 2 frames, or 12 or 18 frames to another 24 frames, even in some cases, which is quite long. And you're changing things and you touch it in order for it to be something, I don't know, like this. And in a certain way, and those the changes in lighting, in order to create sensations and to take you and to experiment, I don't know. And I'm sorry, and I'm sure that I'm sorry, but it's got nothing to do with your question, but there's something that made me very sad, and this is, we've inherited from the Franco era, and we're still in that stage. The film was dubbed to one single language, in this case Spanish. The wealth, the power, the identity of this film are the invention of the boy who lives in, or the guy that lives in New York, those that speak Brazilian with different accents, very rigorous and very happily. And the Argentinian Indians with the Videla, what a bastard. But in any case, the film can be seen in the original version with whoever want, and those who want to see the dubbed version, they can see the dubbed version. What I mean by this is that from the San Sebastian Film Festival, we can start to say, how can we continue, or the audience that is asking, well, I'm very lazily and I don't want to listen to other languages. The fabulous thing is, I don't know, when you see a film, an Iranian, an Indian, Japanese film, Russian film, how can you dub this? What are you doing? The work that all of the voices, for example, those that speak English with a Brazilian accent, are we going to lose that? It's very sad. I say this as, well, let's make a bigger effort and stop dubbing films. It's very poor. I don't know. I remember many years ago, I saw a Woody Allen film dubbed, and I left the film. I said, I never leave a film, even if it's a poor, bad film, but I'll stay to the end. Sometimes it's very difficult, for example, to take the record off at Satisfaction in a Rolling Stones record. But it makes you feel bad to say he's halfway through a solo and you're going to cut him off. No, not at all. I want to clear something out, if anyone doesn't, if there's any confusion. The musicians that Chubby were talking about, the truth is, they are musicians that helped us, because in order to animate that scene, there's no document of any film of when that music was being recorded. So therefore, in order to have the movements, the exact movements of the musicians, and to not do anything stupid, we asked some musicians to learn the solos of the original recording, which can be seen. They're not playing what we're seeing, but it's Tenorio with Paulo Moura, Raul de Souza, Mireilles, with those musicians there. But we needed the visual information of how they're playing, so therefore their instruments. So we asked the musicians to study the solos and the improvisations, and they did a great job. It was incredible, and that was very important in order to do that sequence with a certain sense and also in a very serious way. Over here, good morning, I'm from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro. Excuse my mixture of Spanish and Portuguese. Two questions. Could you please talk about the participation of Marcelo Quintanilla in the construction of the drawings? And secondly, is it impossible for us in Brazil to listen to the word military government and dictator without thinking about Bolsonaro? The ghost of Bolsonaro, was that a presence in the end, in the completion of the film? How was it to work with that issue in Brazil, which was still in this government, which a horrible man like Bolsonaro? Thank you very much. What a beautiful accent. Bastard. Well, it's great to have a Brazilian here in the audience, amongst the journalists. Well, first of all, we had a producer was very interested in the film in Brazil. We couldn't do that because Bolsonaro won the elections. All the aid to cinema and culture was cut off, and we lost our co-producer in Brazil. At the end, the film is done with the co-production of Holland. Janek is here with Spain, Cristina, and with Portugal and France. But we couldn't have Brazil due to that issue. What was the other question? Marcelo Quintanilla. He was already in Chico and Rita with us. Martino Quintanilla is a great drawer, and he lives in Barcelona. He was born in Viterroy, which is on the other side of the bay of Rio de Janeiro. And of course, he's from Viterroy. He says Viterroy sounds much better in his language. And we had already worked together, and he was a person who was very important in the production of Chico and Rita. He's a great drawer. He received the Angoulême Award of his last comic, which is marvelous. And plus, he does the scripts and he does the drawing as well. And so therefore, it's quite curious because is a girl who's not white like me. She lives in a favela, and she's a nurse. And the people in Brazil say, why do you make comics, do comics of poor people? No, I'm talking, or black people. But they always say poor people, they don't say black people. Marcelo is a great drawer of comics, and so we've known each other quite well. I said, please, Marcelo, the film is crying out for realistic characters. I'm very limited, and realism isn't my line of work. But all of a sudden, I take them and deform them, and I try to do other types of things. So therefore, the animators and drawers, if you in a position you make the shoulder be a bit larger than the other one, these deformations, they don't understand them, and at the end of the day, it complicates things for them. Marcelo has a great quality that characters, first of all, I would start them up, and Marcelo, I give it to Marcelo to continue it, working on it, and then it brings it back to me. We set up a series of graphic strategies. The heads are much larger than a normal head on the screen, especially the mouths, the hands, and the feet. Marcelo initially thought it was very complicated. He said, oh, they're going to look like they're very big-headed. But we were interested in doing a caricature, albeit it's realistic. But I think it's done in a way in which, by Marcelo so elegantly, that the audience, it's a third, more than a third large of any head that appears. So therefore, with Marcelo, what we did was, once we had the character, he did everything. For animation, we need about, it's like a police records, that say, face from side on, profile, how they move, and expressions. I don't know how to do that, because everything I do in expression, it's another character and this, that, and the other. And characters like Jeff, for example, or Joao, are very, very well worked and created thanks to Quintanilla. It's also, it's like Fernando. He's very straightforward, he's a really nice guy. And no matter how much you're telling Marcelo, Jesus, you've done this wrong, I'm quite hysterical, and all of a sudden I start to insult him and so on and so forth. But Marcelo, for example, and Fernando, not at all. Marcelo is like, he's an English lord, but Brazilian. It was a real gift, and it was very good to have a Brazilian there, because he speaks very good Brazilian. In any case, Marcelo, we asked him about things about Brazil, even musical, because he knows a lot about music. Pernau and the editor, Xavi and myself, we always asked Marcelo many things, and he did a few voices in the film as well. For example, careful when you draw a beer, which in Ipanema, because this has a different form that you don't know in Spain. So therefore, you go to Google or Safari or whatever, and you write this in, and you go, all of a sudden you've got that beer there. It didn't exist with Chico and Rita. Thanks to, we started with the production during COVID, and we were convinced, Cristina, the producer, of 2 or 3 trips, Fernando and I, to take some notes. In Rio, perhaps 2 or 3 months, to inspire ourselves. No, not even one day. We were all stuck at home. What a bummer. Thank God we had the internet. And Villarino, which is the famous bar, very famous, which is well known, where Vinicius de Moraes met Joabim. Well, we had to nail it, because imagine someone from Rio telling, like, no, this is horrible because you didn't get it right. Like Woody Allen's film Barcelona. I said, listen, Woody Allen, you don't know you've got no idea of what Barcelona is, which is shameful. Well, at least to not feel insulted, but to do, because we're talking about the identity of a city which tries, where the jungle tries to eat all of the houses and overtake them, and it's very vibrant with a light, and then you can see it. It's an one of the important characters in the film is Rio in the film. Truffaut has changed the life of many people. Jeff Harris, I thought it's great to listen to this, because there's something autobiographical. There's a lot of genre. There's one is autobiographical, because Ted Harris seems like Fernando Trueba, with 2 passions, cinema and music, are hand in hand. You got 400 shots, but some of the shelves that were created, you see Picasso and some other things. It was difficult to read them. Now, I saw the film. I normally look at these. Yes, I do. On the bottom right, I remember. I might kiss you in the mouth later, because you saw that. But thank God Google nor internet was there, because in this film wouldn't have been possible, as you said. the research work in the film and the detective work in the film, The Truth, with the facility of accessing to de-information, well, that we have, the disinformation we have now, you wouldn't have managed to achieve it. So therefore, later, there's the political background when, with the interview to the American, and the map of the background there in the US, all in black, to seeing that the culture not only disappeared, Tenorio Jr., but that was a coup for the cultural evolution of the world. I enjoyed it very much. I just would like to point that out, that there are a lot of genres in the film, and it's a pleasure, and there are different passions. And what's your collaboration, what's it like? There's no two without three. Is there a third collaboration on the way? Well, you can't say this because things work, but when you're crazy, but I imagine maybe they're not. And if you've got something, we have another COVID, and let's spend another 3 months in lockdown doing that field work on a screen. No, it's true what you say about cinema, but it's curious. When Milton Nascimento says Truffaut changed his life, it seemed as if I'd written that in the script, but it turns out it did change. Truffaut changed my life. I always say my vacation stumps when I'm 15 years, I see Niño Salvaje or by Truffaut. Milton, it's true what he says in the film. I was surprised. And how was I not going to lead that in the film, for example? Another director, that would be a dialogue that would have taken out in the editing room, because it doesn't seem to have any relationship with the case that we're talking about, but it did have a relationship here. It was directly related. Why wasn't I going to keep that confession by Milton? Milton, he says, he becomes a composer when he sees Silje Jim, the night. And that's beautiful, and it forms part of that type of cinematographic subtext that the film has at all times, underlying not only the music, politics, and the story of Tenorio, the story of Bossa Nova, but also cinema. There's an underground current which can be seen there. Another big gift that Fernando brought to us is the ending, where Fernando realized that there existed an interview made on Argentinian TV by Vinicius de Moraes a week or a couple of days after that Tenorio had just disappeared. He was absolutely in a wreck in his apartment at that time, so therefore they were able to find that interview, and we both agreed, and I've always thanked him, Fernando, very much for this, because it's an unpublished, unreleased piece. No one has seen it, and he found it, and he provided it as another document for the film. And I said, we'll do this in animation. Why? Because it makes no sense. If it's all animation, let's not put that in now, because when you see it for real, you're fascinated by the looks of despair, that look that he looks sideways. Vinicius is like, and how he speaks this mixture between Portuguese and Spanish, which is quite curious. And that's something which, it's a film, how was it? Yes, The Truth, it's a negative which is positive. No, it was shot in the 1970s. Here in Spain, we did the same thing when the newsreels recorded, when they went out for an interview, they recorded it in reversible 16 millimeters. The camera didn't have a negative. The negative, when you revealed it, became positive, and it was a unique copy. And it came from negative to positive, and it was only used to show something that had happened out in the street. There had been an attack here, or there had been whatever. So therefore, this interview, quite probably, Vinicius himself, 4 days after Tenorio disappearing in despair, he called someone for interview him with the objective of seeking help so that someone can help him to find Tenorio. Just when he does the interview, that morning is when the tanks come out into the street in Buenos Aires, and what happens is that the interview is never shown in Argentina, which is what it was stuck in a can, really, the reel, and neither in Brazil, where there's a dictatorship for several years before. So therefore, Tenorio is stuck in the middle of those two dictatorships. In the middle, his disappearance is never investigated as it would be investigated in a normal situation, as we could say. And that reel of film, what I've never known why it arrives in Brazil, where we find it is not in Buenos Aires. We find it in Brazil. It was in a global warehouse, and the Antonio Venancio, the person in search who was researching and looking for documents and so forth, he talks to me and he tells me, and he said he done that work in the documentary by Vinicius. There's many Brazilian documentaries, so he's a super professional. He says there's a reel of film of an interview with Vinicius that I've not seen, and nobody knows what he says. But it's that time. Let's have a look at it. Let's watch it to see whether we can find anything there. So therefore, just like it happens in the film, they go to the global building and they show us the 16 millimeters. They sit us down. They show us the screen. They put it on the screen for us. And when we see Vinicius talking and only talking about this, well, we started to cry. It was a moment in which, because Vinicius was the piece that was missing. He is a man had died 3 or 4 years after Tenorio's disappearance in 1980, and we didn't have his version of what of the facts. There was nothing. We had to imagine it because of what other people told us, and all of a sudden, including that in the film, was beautiful, and including it, just as it occurred, all of a sudden Vinicius was telling us something. He was telling us the anguish that he had during those days. Okay, this is the last question. Yes, quickly, congratulations for the linguistic side of things. But something I'd like to ask you, why did you decide to give the storyteller, give it to this character who's a journalist, who's North American, who's a specialist in music? But mainly, if you compare it with the characters, the real characters that exist, he's a very banal character. Typical gringo, very naive, technically very good, he knows a lot about music. Well, I decided to make the American journalist because it seemed to be much more coherent than to making a Spanish film director. Spain didn't have a big repercussion in Brazilian music of that time. In the US had a great influence. So therefore, I was thinking, what's reality? That a Spanish director has gone to Brazil 35 years later, 40 years, to research and investigate the disappearance of a Brazilian in Argentina. That sounded like Chinese to me, that reality. So I thought it would be much more interesting and much richer for it to be an American journalist, due to the link of the United States with music, due to the influence that American music had in the bossa nova musicians. The precursors of bossa nova, Johnny Alf, Dick Farney, people who there in the 50s and who were the predecessors of bossa nova, were the founders of the fan club of Frank Sinatra. But that information of Elis Regina says that Chet Baker was his great influence. So therefore, it seemed to me that musical relationship with the United States and Brazil was much greater and much more intensive than what Spain had. So therefore, perhaps it could have been a French person, because the French had a lot of things, not so much in the United States, but it had quite a lot of influence in Brazilian music. But the fact that America had a direct relationship in the political background of Latin America in the 1970s made it twice as interesting for it to be an American, because it's not to blame, but you can feel a certain blame of what your country, the role that your country has historically played there. So therefore, all of that reasoning made me incline myself to an American character. Fiction is much better than reality. Reality is a bit... Well, reality, what it tells us is that the press conference comes to an end. A big round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you.